Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. We are back, another new year. My name is Dwayne. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, how you doing tonight?
Absolutely excellent. It's going to be fun to get back to talking comics and finding out a little bit more about 2002, which most of us are old enough to remember. That was a time when the world was kind of a dangerous and frightening place. America was trying to come to terms with a lot of things in terms of how to move forward from 9/11 and all that. So both internally and on the world stage, we had a lot of questions. And comics actually showed a lot of that anxiety. We're going to see that, especially as we start going through some of the Marvel stuff this year. Even so, though, when we come down to the micro scale of just comics themselves, this was actually a big year for pretty much everybody involved in the comics world.
Really?
Sales of
Okay.
Yeah. So sales of actual honest to goodness comic books actually rose 10% this year, up to $230 million. It's the first time we'll see that the industry's actually seen that occur since 1993, when sales had peaked at around $850 million. So,
far cry from where it was, but it's nice that it's actually going in the right direction at least.
The arrow is up, but man, is it a long way from being back where it was before, right? But even as traffic in stores was increasing, Hollywood was also starting to understand how to make comic properties work sort of on their screens, both small and large. And you really start to see sort of everything moving forward for the comic industry, both in larger culture and actually within the print world itself. So it can be interesting.
I also think it would be remiss of us if not just teasing a little bit for next week. It is quite the year for Daredevil as well.
Yes, this is actually, as we were rereading them, I think this is actually the series that brought me back to really being reeled in on Daredevil. Like, I enjoyed the Kevin Smith books, but I enjoyed them because they were sort of a cool Kevin Smith is doing comics kind of arc. And I, liked Daredevil back in the Frank Miller days. But Bendis, this is it. This is when Daredevil becomes the thing for a good long while. These are fantastic stories.
Yes. I remember back in the Moon Knight days, we had a run with Brian Michael Bendis on Moon Knight, and it was different but pretty cool. I liked it. These are I'm sorry, but these are another level.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the other thing though is that Bendis he's redefining or refining Daredevil really in a way that's very consistent with the character.
Sure.
The Bendis Moon Knight run is batshit, and it is not consistent with the character.
No,
he replaces Jake and those guys with Spider-Man and Wolverine, and basically the alters completely are not what they used to be, and everything is just messed up. There's just a million things wrong with the Daredevil or with the Moon Knight Bendis run. Yes. I still enjoy it, but it has to be taken as completely its own thing. Whereas these are just foundational to Daredevil, and they feel fantastically Daredevil. So next week is going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, but we've got a week worth of 2002 to talk about before then. So why don't we jump in? Because it sounds like there's going to be a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there absolutely is. A lot of good stuff.
The year in comics. All right, Dan. The year in comics, 2002. We've been starting kind of in movies and TV shows the last few years. I'm guessing this year's no different. We've got some things going on from Hollywood in their attempts to monetize the comic book um material that they've gotten a hold of.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting year for comic book movies and television shows. First thing, you've still got a lot of the ones that started kind of still rolling along. But as far as new things, we have the Jugman animated TV movie, which is an Archie's TV movie, starring Jughead, of course. We have Sabrina Friends Forever, which is an animated TV movie. You're going to see the Sabrina the Teenage Witch stuff popping up pretty regularly here. This is a
Uh-huh.
big part of early 2000s American teen culture. We also had Welcome to Eltingville, which, if you remember the Adult Swim animated shows from the early 2000s, they had a bunch of really interesting stuff. This is actually one that was based on a comic. It was animated out for Adult Swim, actually from a comic book by Evan Dorkin that was published through Dark Horse and Slave Labor Graphics. So it comes out of the Eltingville, it was Eltingville stories that were done by Dorkin a few years previously. This did not get an actual full um, full run. There was a pilot and I think a few other things that came out. Um, Outside of that, a relatively light year for new stuff in television. So Smallville's still going though and stuff like that, and there are still some
Sure.
some things that are kind of solid presences in TV.
What about in the cinema? Because it does look like there were some pretty interesting things that came out this year.
This was for for pre MCU days. This was a pretty premium year of comic book movies, and not just because we had the number one with a bullet Spider-Man come out, right? Which we'll talk about in a while, which is kind of your classic. I mean, that's a comic book movie, right? But the other
Right.
ones, we had Blade 2 come out, which sequel where basically they bring back Christopherson's character again. Everybody returns. Um, Actually, pretty well received. Made $150 million at the box office. Wesley Snipes basically comes out and says, "I love playing this character. I would play this character forever or till I'm 90 or whatever." And he's literally good to his word, right? Like he's coming back. So it
Uh-huh.
was interesting reading up about this. He's talking about, yeah, I love this character. And so when he talks about nobody else is ever going to be Blade, it sounds like he's been setting his setting his flag on this is his character for a long time now. And I think that's pretty cool. But Blade 2 is a lot of fun. I didn't like it as much as the first one, but it was still a really entertaining movie. And I like that again, comic book movie, but really it's more like an action horror type movie, right?
Right.
We get Men in Black 2, which is a comic book
Oh,
movie,
yes.
but it's really more of like a sci-fi movie, right?
Yes.
They're off on essentially like a hunt to find, not to spoil everything, but I think it turns out to be some girl who's important somehow or whatever. And Men in Black 2, again, mixed reviews, but $445 million, which is why we get Men in Black 3, obviously, right? So that
And,
one,
and again, they didn't really play up the fact that this was a comic book movie either, just like they did with the first one a few years ago.
no, not at all. This is really it's a buddy cop science fiction movie, right?
Right.
There are no flights and tights. So this is another comic book movie that isn't really a comic book movie. We get Road to Perdition, which is essentially a 1920s era gangster movie about a kid who kind of, is on the lam. Uh, this is also made $181 million on a relatively low budget, had massive stars from Paul Newman and Tom Hanks and all of these sorts of folks in it, nominated for Oscars. It even won an Oscar for cinematography. comic book movie because it was based off of a graphic novel by Max Allan Collins from a few years before. But no one would ever think about this as a comic book movie. It's
I
a,
certainly did not. Yeah.
and then we read the comic a while ago, and then the like, and it's a great comic book as well, great graphic novel. But
Yeah.
you would watch this and you'd be like, this is a gangster movie. This is 1920s period piece, sort of thing. Um, and it's interesting because all of these show that they could adapt material from all over, and that comic books were making material that you could turn into successful pop culture stories from all sorts of genres and sources.
Right.
We even had Tales from the Crypt Presents Ritual, which is kind of it probably was a made for TV movie or direct to video type thing by this point. But there were a bunch of Tales from the Crypt videos, which are based off like the EC Comics horror type stuff and that sort of thing. Again, I think a lot of people in the know would realize that Crypt Keeper and the like come from the comic books back in the day. But I also think there's a lot of young horror fans who had no idea these were ever comic books. They just
I
thought it
did.
was an original character.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did not had no idea that those were based on comic books.
So, again, one of these that's out there kind of almost like stealthily mining comics for pop culture. But then we get Spider-Man by Sam Raimi, starring Tobey Maguire and Kristen Dunst, that comes in, absolutely blows the doors off of the summer, makes first film ever to make $100 million in its opening weekend, comes up with $826 million total, and essentially changes everything because suddenly, if a studio wants to make a comic book movie, do they want to make Road to Perdition, where they can bank a cool 181 million and get an Oscar, or do they want to make Spider-Man and make 826 freaking $1 million, right?
Yeah, this is a tentpole summer blockbuster that ran into the fall that,
So,
it was the talk of everything.
and to be fair, it's pretty fantastic.
It is
Like, I
so
don't know if there's
fantastic.
anybody who has ever been a comic book fan, especially somebody from my era, my generation, who'd seen like the 1970s Spider-Man television show, or seen a lot of the bungled adaptations that we'd seen through the 90s of all of these properties. And then you see Spider-Man by Sam Raimi, and it's a comic book come to life, right? And it was so fantastic in terms of its special effects, in terms of the way that Spidey sort of swung from building to building. But more than that, it also captured everything right about the characters. It captured everything right about Peter Parker and Mary Jane, and it was just spot on. And because of that, I think we were all over the moon happy, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that it really did overshadow the fact that there were an awful lot of other comic book adaptations possible that could find success. But coming out of 2002, the only one people really remember is Spider-Man. So that
Yeah,
said, what did you think of Spider? Do
it's
you remember
oh,
Spider-Man back in the day?
I re- I remember specifically going to it in the theaters because I thought that it would be it looked like it was going to be good. And I didn't see it right away, I don't think, but I heard lots of really good things. I mean, the thing that surprised me is Sam Raimi as the director
Yep,
because he was doing things like Evil Dead and Bruce Campbell. Bruce Campbell was
yep,
in everything he was doing, and it was horror and all this sort of stuff. And I mean, they nailed it. You had, and it was the origin story, so you had Uncle Ben dying, but at the same time, it was just it like even if you didn't know anything about Spider-Man, which seemed hard to not know anything about Spider-Man, but I didn't actually go in knowing a ton about Spider-Man.
yep.
You just instantly latched onto the character and the world and everything that we got to see. That's the one with Willem Dafoe, right? As the Green Goblin.
Yes.
Yes.
Which to me is the only, I didn't like the Green Goblin's mask and the Green Goblin's costume. That always bothered me. But it's
Okay.
really the only thing that bothered me. And I may be alone because now, decades later, they're bringing back that same mask and that same look when they're doing other things. So maybe that's just the way it has to be. So, but yeah,
It
he was
was,
fantastic though.
yeah, big soundtrack as well that was really popular all that summer as well, and it was just it was a juggernaut. And yeah, it's hard to remember that there were some other really good adaptations, but it also, I sort of like, I almost feel like this sort of then is you we're getting closer and closer to sort of the MCU version of a comic book movie, right? Because it's like we're we've been going, so we've been getting there slowly but surely, but it just seems like this was the closest we'd come yet. And we saw that if you can make a action movie with some humor in it, have a really good story with some really cool characters, it can transcend just not just the comic book audience, but can be a just a cultural phenomenon in its own right.
And I think that the interesting thing was that, X-Men had come out just a little while ago and had essentially been very similar in terms of it had, it had been successful, it had treated the material well, but the big difference was it didn't revel in sort of the guy in the bright red and blue spandex type of thing. I think a lot of people thought that that was just a bridge too far. But once you actually
Right.
put the character in a comic book accurate costume, it would all just fall apart. And it didn't all fall apart. And that's probably the genius of Spider-Man more than anything, is it's the first one where everything kind of worked in terms of just buying into it and going, okay, literally, this is a superhero comic book. You're going to have somebody running around in their weird little tights and their mask, and you're going to believe it, and you're going to have fun
Uh-huh.
with it. And we
Yep.
all did, you know? And you had your Stan Lee cameo, you had your Bruce Campbell cameo, obviously, because like you said, it is after all one of his movies. And if he's going to
Yes.
make a, if he's going to make a movie, he's going to put Bruce Campbell in it. I think he was the ring announcer, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. That's not the, yeah, I
And
think
then again,
that's right.
and then the next one,
And
he's the theater guy or something.
yeah.
So
This also isn't, this is also the first time we see J. Jonah Jameson too, if I remember right.
yes, yep.
So we get
Well, I mean, there
J.K.
would have been
Sim.
one in the previous adaptations, but I
Right, but
believe
I
that
mean,
it's already the guy, right?
J.K. Simmons.
Yeah, I think Simmons is already him in this one, isn't he?
Well, yeah, I'm saying I thought this was the first movie he was the guy.
Oh, it is. Yeah, yep.
Yes. So
Yeah,
so
because there have been really no live adaptations previously of Spider-Man, really, other than like the TV show back in the 70s. But yeah, he basically took that role and Simmons owned it so completely that
yes.
he's got like a
Hey,
Wesley Snipes grip on it,
yes. I mean, to be fair, it's like, they were like, we're just not going to have J. Jonah Jameson in a Spider-Man movie until we can have J.K. Simmons be
Yep.
J. Jonah Jameson, and then we get to see him, finally here in the MCU eventually once
Yep.
Tom Holland could and all that could happen. But it was just like there was just so many things eh, about this that just ended up being kind of this is this is who I think of now when I think of these characters, and it
Yep.
ended up being that way for the better part of a decade.
Yep. It was pretty crazy. But so that is, I mean, without any question, from a cultural impact, the first Spider-Man film is the biggest thing that happened with comic books in 2002. But we did have a bunch of other stuff actually on the printed page. So we can hit some of that too if you'd like.
Yes. What's going on? What's going on over at DC then?
Big year for DC as well. Um, they had Superman and Batman both hit their 600th issue in sort of air quotes because they'd been sort of canceled and then come back and whatever.
Reset, yeah.
But Superman and Batman both hit 600. We had Hush come out by Loeb and Lee. So this is Jim Lee's first real big comic work since selling his studio Wildstorm and coming to DC. And it's I think either 6 or 8 issue series that he did with Jeff Loeb, where the Hush storyline kind of sets the pace for a lot of things that are going to be happening in Batman's sort of world over the next decade. Things that have to do with Robin and with his parents and with Gotham's history. And it's really a cool story. It's also fantastically beautifully drawn. His is Jim Lee just absolutely destroying every other artist, basically. He really is pretty talented when he puts his mind to it. And there are a lot of people who kind of give Jeff Loeb some crap. He can essentially, every once in a while he gets a little bit wordy or things like this. But I think this was a really well-written story. I generally, in fact, like Loeb stuff. And I really enjoyed Hush. Ed Brubaker and Darwin Cook rebooted Catwoman. It had like a 90-some issue run where Catwoman was basically like a balloon-chested sort of cheesecake sort of item in the 90s from Jim Ballant. And they rebooted it, gave her a new sort of sleek outfit that's a little bit more just like a leather jumpsuit with a helmet and the like. And at the end of the previous Catwoman run, she'd sort of apparently been killed. You didn't really know. Kind of knew because nobody's going to kill Catwoman. Obviously, she'll be back. But when the new series starts, she's sort of in hiding a little bit. And Darwin Cook is an absolute master of the comic book form. We lost him a few years ago, which was pretty tragic because he's absolutely one of my favorite artists. Brubaker's stories were great. These Catwoman books were some of the best comics of the early 2000s. So that was a lot of fun. Gotham Central, which is probably, I think, my favorite mainstream DC book of the early 2000s, debuted. And it's actually a look at regular cops essentially having to do their job in the zoo that is Gotham City, right? So it's basically kind of like, if you remember that one where we Marvels or whatever, where you had the journalists who were sort of wandering around the Marvel universe trying to deal with these gods fighting with each other. Well, this is sort of that same idea. And it's something that then spawns out a few characters that are going to be going into other things and the like. Really a good series. I actually have a splash page from Gotham Central up on my wall. It's one of my favorite pieces of original art that I have. So other than that, Justice League Adventures came out, which is sort of a JLA for kids book. That was one, it continued for a few years and I got them in back issues. So those are some of the first comic books Ben had because I bought him Justice League Adventures comics when he was young. Over at Vertigo, we had a couple fantastic series begin. Fables by Bill Willingham and Steve Lilhola started out. Mark Buckingham's going to take over an art relatively soon, and he's the one that's, for the most part, like associated with Fables, but Lilhola actually was the guy who started it. The covers also originally were by a guy named James Jean, and he is a fantastic artist who's now gone on to do a lot of more like fine art prints and things like this. He doesn't really do a lot of comic book art anymore, but his covers were worth the price of the book themselves, even if they didn't have story inside. So absolutely loved the Fables books. Why the Last Man, which was one of the bigger series of the early 2000s, came out, started essentially one where the base idea is that all of the men on the planet have been killed by essentially a gender plague, and there's just one guy left. And of course, he's deeply in love with a girl who happens to be in Australia, and he's someplace in America. And instead of making do with one of the hundreds of millions of women between here in Australia, he has to go and find her. And so that's the plan. Um, the Filth comes out by Grant Morrison and Weston. That is a weird story, but it's Morrison essentially starting to even play with the form of comics, and it's deeply experimental. It's pan-dimensional and all this other stuff. Kind of makes your head hurt every once in a while, but it was pretty amazing.
Okay.
And then League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Volume 2 came out. So the first volume had been extremely well received. They bring out another one as well. This again is under the ABC imprint of DC because Alan Moore still is having nothing to do with DC proper, even though all his stuff is published through DC Comics, just with the DC crossed out and his ABC imprint put on top instead. So there you go.
Yeah. All right. So what about some of the other publishers this year? Did we see some big things from some of them?
So there's always a lot of stuff. I mean, I've just hit a few highlights. One of them, oddly, is a new company came out this year that really hadn't done anything before. And not only did they hit the ground running, but Dreamwave, which splits off from Image in 2002 to become its own company, actually manages to have like 7 of the top 10 selling comic books of the year. And,
wow.
And they're all Transformers titles. So
sure,
they hit it
okay.
really big with Transformers. Saraceni did the writing on these. Lee, Reyes, Armstrong, Garcia, a bunch of different people did the art across a few different titles. But these were extremely popular and sort of started that whole resuscitation of the nostalgia toy thing of the 80s. So I think what comics
okay.
now begin to realize is that all those guys who were 10 years old and reading Transformers comic books in 1984 are now going to be right around 30 years old and looking to relive that nostalgia or potentially buy comics for their soon to be 10-year-old kids. And so you start to get the nostalgia wave.
And they presumably have more disposable income than they used to have at 10 years old too.
Absolutely. So that was an interesting development. We're going to see a lot more of that sort of stuff. We got The Pro by Garth Ennis and Amanda Conner, which is one of the more deeply disturbing comic books of the time. It's actually about a sort of a superhero prostitute who she's a superhero and super violent and also a hooker. So do with that as you will. Again, Amanda Conner is one of my favorite artists. So the art is really cool, but it's strange and disturbing. Hawaiian Dick came out by Bleakley Moore, which was a mystery series I really enjoyed. So it's one I just wanted to throw out there as one that I would recommend. Also, Hip Flask Unnatural Selection, which was a story by essentially the guy who does a lot of the lettering stuff. He started Comicraft. His name's Richard Starkings. He actually also wrote this book called Hip Flask, which introduced the concept of the elephant men, which are essentially like genetically modified animals that sort of look like people, one of whom is kind of a hippopotamus who's also kind of like a Humphrey Bogart detective. I loved these stories.
Okay.
They were a lot of fun. So They went on, and actually there was a book called Elephant Men that would be published later on. But those started this. The first Unnatural Selection book came out in 2002. We also had a couple of things that were, well, one of them is a graphic novel. It was actually Spiegelman's novel, The Shadow of No Towers, which came out kind of in 2002 because it was released in 2002 in Germany because no American publisher would touch it. And so he couldn't get it published in America until 2006. Sure. And the reason is, and Spiegelman's a Jewish guy, And he said that the book is not only a personal memoir of his experience of being in New York during the attack, it's also a strong socialist criticism of the US government's actions following the attacks. He accuses the Bush administration of using the tragedy as a way to justify their agenda. So I read that on a one or two different blog sites. That was kind of a general analysis of what it was, what that was about. I have never read it, so be interested to actually check that out. See how it is now available in America, but it wasn't for a while. So nonetheless, they say
Yeah.
pre-published in Deceit over in Germany that year. So again, this is the sort of thing where we were in one of those periods where certain types of dissent were not really
Yeah.
welcome or
No.
tolerated in America. And so because of that, he found a different place to publish. Yes, one of the other things we had was a book called B. Kriegstein by Sadowski. It's actually looked at Bernie Kriegstein of EC's work, very specifically breaking down kind of formally how he did things and looking at not only the comic story, but also fundamentally like how he did panels and everything. Because his story Master Race is actually looked at as sort of a formative comic book in terms of the way that panels and pacing and timing work in comics. And essentially
Okay.
in the space of one comic book, which was supposed to be like a 6-page or 5-page story, and he turned it into an 8-page story, which did not fit at all. And evidently his editor at EC was just like, I guess we just have to change the print size because we can't change your story.
Gee,
And so they
no.
just ran it through because it was that good. And it's become kind of a classic of the genre or of the medium. And what's interesting is what he did really is he had a couple of things with like somebody falling onto train tracks and the like, and he just cut it up into these cinematic slices, which just sort of makes time stand still. And so there's times he makes time move really fast, times makes it move really slow, and he did it in a way really where just nobody'd ever noticed before you could do that sort of thing. So it's cool though because we didn't really have a lot of comic artists given this sort of appreciation in sort of a monograph form before. So gonna have a lot of them later.
You said this book ended up going on to win an Eisner Award?
Yep, it does. The B. Krigstein book wins an Eisner for um, I don't know, best. We'll talk about it when we get to Eisner's. I've got it written down
Okay.
someplace. But
All right.
yeah, it wins for some sort of nonfiction type of Eisner. And then another book that came out, which I'm kind of cheating here, because Comic Book Nation, The Transformation of Youth Culture in America, by a guy named Bradford Wright, actually released in 2001, kind of late. And then it has a 2003 second edition with a coda.
Sure.
So, and they're different. So I'm just going to talk about it in 2002, which is right in the middle, and then we don't have to talk about it twice. This is probably my favorite, or at least used to be my favorite introduction to the history of comics. Like if somebody wants to just read a book about the history of American comic books, I think Comic Book Nation is where you'd send them. Now there's a new one that just came out this last year called American Comics: A History or something like this, which may have actually surpassed it now. And partly that's because Comic Book Nation is 25 years old and
Right.
its
A lot has
content's a little
happened.
old.
Yeah.
Some of its ideas are a little bit old. There's just a lot of things that could be updated in it. That said, the fact he did update it in 2003 was actually relatively unfortunate because the only difference between the 2001 and 2003 edition is the 2003 edition has an additional chapter dealing with 2001 and the World Trade Center, the 9/11 attacks. And it is hastily written and bitter and not really particularly good academic work. So it's a really good book that if you do get the 2003 second edition has a poorly thought out, very angry ending that does not necessarily fit with the rest of the book.
Gotcha.
But nonetheless, I highly recommend Comic Book Nation. I think it was really a foundational text for comics criticism and comics in academia. And I don't know really any book that's been written probably in the last 20 years that doesn't somewhere in its bibliography have Wright's book, because they all went back to it at some point.
Right. All right, let's talk about some of the industry news and trends that are going on. You talked about sales finally ticking upwards by about 10%. Are we talking comics themselves, or graphic novels seem to have been pretty popular the last couple of years? Is that maybe help that number?
Yep, you're 100% correct. Comics, the industry went up by 10%. Like pamphlet comics, regular monthly comics were about a 5% increase. Graphic novels were up 59%. But of course, the graphic novel was a small enough part of the market at that point that its bigger increase, it going up 60%, helped just as much as comics going up 5%, right?
Right.
Yeah. Marvel ended up leading overall in units at 40% and in dollars at 34%, kind of coming back from that little downturn to solidly take control of the market again. So they're back up on top. What I found interesting, though, is we are now up to 9 publishers that were over 1% of market share this year.
Wow.
Which is nice. So a little bit better than because it's been like 6 for a lot of the last few years, or maybe 7. Back in the 90s, we had way more than just this that were over 1%, because it was a very diverse market. But now we're starting to get a little bit of these green shoots of smaller companies being able to muscle their way in and get a decent percentage of the market.
So what were some of the big titles this year?
Well, we talked about Dreamwave getting those Transformers books, but also Ultimates #1 was huge, and all the Ultimates books. Dark Knight Strikes Again by Frank Miller, awful though it was, continued to sell well.
Sure.
Wolverine Origin finished up and it sold really well, and then the Batman Hush issues actually also sold really well.
Wait a minute. There's something missing here.
Yes. It's kind of strange, isn't it? Like, just last year and the previous years, it's dominated by X-Men books. And X-Men didn't come in any higher than 21st. That was the first of the individual selling issues. That was the highest X-Men book, was 21st place, which is really weird. And I think it's something that makes sense to ponder on, because if you think about how you just had a successful X-Men movie, there's another X-Men movie getting ready to come out soon. We're in a time where these characters are at the highest in popular culture they've ever been. Most people had no idea what an X-Man was in 1999, when they were selling countless numbers of comic books in comic store terms, right?
Right.
They were the big fish in the little pond. Now they're out in the bigger pond and people can see them, but it's not really helping their sales at all in terms of the comic store. And I think that's something interesting that is a point we should continue to look at as we move along, is that it's weird how little how little it matters what's going on in terms of what's popular on TV and in popular in film in terms of what sells in the comic store. Now,
okay,
what sells in the bookstore, that's going to be different.
Oh yeah, I would bet.
So like when we get to the 2020s here, when James Gunn came out and said the Supergirl that we're doing is going to be based on this one Supergirl story, right?
Yeah,
sales of that graphic novel,
off the shelf. Yeah,
they were gone. DC literally had to come out and say, we're going to do another printing. We understand you're all trying to find this book and you can't now, right?
Yeah.
But at this point, there's a real disconnect between, even if somebody is interested in X-Men after the movie, do they even know where to find the comic books? Or maybe worse, do they find the comic books? dig into the middle of X-Men and go, oh my God,
What the heck is going on?
I'm going to have to read 30 years of backstory to know what's going on, and there's 500 characters. Do I really want to start with this?
Yeah.
You know?
No,
So
that makes sense.
but it is interesting that even as X-Men is succeeding at the cinema, and it's been huge in, like, the X-Men cartoons of the 90s,
Right.
there should be this massive sort of push for X-Men content coming through the pipeline, and instead it's sort of drying up a little bit.
Yeah, that's really surprising. That's really surprising. Mm-hmm. There was the first time we had an event this year.
Free Comic Book Day, May 4th, on 2001 or on 2002 was the first comic book day. Joe Field from Comics and Games Retailer magazine actually suggested it. Diamond and a number of the publishers came in and supported it. Among the comics, you had an Ultimate Spider-Man #1 reprint, Star Wars book, Tomb Raider book. The first issue of Justice League Adventures was a Free Comic Book Day giveaway. This became an immediate hit. They gave away millions of comics, and it has continued now right down to present day, usually coinciding with or sort of cross-promoted with whatever the big tentpole movie is that comes out that year. And for this one, for instance, Spider-Man came out right around the time of the very first comics, Free Comic Day.
Yes, and that it's just gotten bigger and bigger every year. And I have been, I went to a couple of these before I was a comic book reader, picked up some comics, but didn't really spend a ton of time on them to really get into them. But now I look forward to this every year. And they moved it around a couple times because of COVID and some of that sort of thing, but it's usually early May.
Correct. And in fact, it's always, other than COVID and stuff, it's always the first weekend in May. So yes, whatever the first weekend, the first Saturday in May is going to be your Free Comic Book Day.
So, and now there's like usually something in the neighborhood of about 60 or so. It feels like comics that you have to choose from.
It's gotten a little ridiculous. And in fact, there's a number of people who say that's one of the problems, is that the stores decide which books they want to bring in. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll go, oh, these are the comic books that people in my store like. And so they order them. But the problem is, originally Free Comic Book Day was about finding people, getting comic books people didn't read into their hands so they might become interested in something new, not just being like, hey, I've got a bunch of Spider-Man fans, let me get the Spider-Man books so they can get the Free Comic Book Day edition, because they're reading Spider-Man anyways. So, but it has been wildly successful, though. It's one of those days where you actually see kids and families wandering out to the comic store. It's places busy all day and hopping. It's just fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Any other industry things you want to touch on?
Main things really is that, those 9/11 charity books are continuing. So we're still seeing those out there, and those almost on every one of them, the artists and the companies are dedicating all their time, donating all their time for free. And then the actual proceeds are going to various relief things for survivors or for first responders and that sort of stuff. So those were successful, and that was something that I think it was really admirable what the industry was doing then. Kind of everybody was trying to do their part a little bit where they could. And of course, because again, comic books have always been a New York institution, really. That's where all of the companies originally came from, where most of the main, sort of like guiding lights of the industry. That's where they either were born or where they settled. So it was a big deal for comics. And then last thing, the Charles M. Schulz Museum opens in Santa Rosa, California this year, which I have been to. It's fantastic. If you ever get a chance to go there, they've got all sorts of original Peanuts strips. They've got interpretive stuff. They've got his old, desk/workspace where he did his work. It is an absolutely fantastic place to go and hang out. we went there and made a pilgrimage, the whole family, and everybody had a really good time. So
I
highly
bet that
recommend it.
I bet that would be a lot of fun. That sounds
Mhm.
like something I would like to see as well.
Super good time.
Right. So what about new publishers starting up, or some ones that came to an end this year?
We had not a whole lot, but IDW did start up its comic publishing arm. It had actually been around doing other things, um, but this was the first time it published comics. I did 30 Days of Night by Niles, Steve Niles, and Ben Templesmith was its very first comic book publication. Albatross started up with The Goon by Eric Powell, and that's actually Powell's own imprint, sort of like Terry Moore's, and everybody else. He's got Abstract. Some of them just decide to publish their own stuff as their own company. Icarus started up. This was, as near as I can tell, an erotic slash manga or erotic manga comic publisher. Uh,
Okay.
I'm not exactly sure what, but they did have over 100 books that they published over time. Active Images was the one that printed Hip Flask. That started up this year. Again, Richard Starkings, Joe Casey writing, and then Ladron on art on that Hip Flask book. And then Dreamwave started up with its Transformers stuff. We also lost a few things. Chaos Comics ended after doing 359 issues. It had Chastity, it had Bad Kitty, it had Lady Death, it had Evil Ernie. Um, Kind of that naughty girl in bikini vibe was sort of.
Oh yes.
Most of those characters have continued on with other publishers. So it's not like we haven't seen Lady Death since. She's all over the place. We just didn't see her coming from Chaos Comics anymore.
Sure.
Um, Crusade also folded. They'd been the publisher of Billy Tucci's She comics, as well as Lethargic Lad. So those were, 130 issues that they'd published overall. So they were a pretty decent publisher. And then Arrow had managed 88 issues when it folded, many of them being The Realm, which is kind of a Dungeons Dragons fantasy book, or Land of Oz, which is more of a Frank Baum kind of Crazy World of Oz type of comic.
All right. It looks like we have a couple notable passings this year as well.
Yep. Um, Chuck Jones, who was the sort of one of the major illustrators of a lot of the WB cartoons, Bugs Bunny, that sort of stuff. We lost him. Um, our friend Mike actually it still works with like the Chuck Jones Center or whatever every year to do kind of things at his ballpark and the like. So Chuck Jones has continued on with some really good stuff. His legacy continues, which is neat. Um, Tom Sutton, who I think has worked on Daredevil. He did a lot of stuff for Marvel and the like back in the day and was a talented artist and inker and creator. And Robert Kanigher, who worked for DC for a long time. I mention him mostly because he is the person who de-kinkified Wonder Woman, essentially. Where
Sure.
after the 1940s and the like, when you get into the 50s and get the Comics Code Authority and the like, and even before then, he was the one that took over from the original creator of Wonder Woman and sort of turned her into more of a domesticated American sort of acceptable female superheroine. So um, Kanigher wrote a lot of stories. He was very, very straight laced, kind of the traditional side of DC Comics.
Gotcha. All right. Let's move on and let's talk about the Eisners for 2002. These would have come out obviously in 2003. What were some of the big winners this year?
2003 awards for 2002 were Magician and the Snake by the Mignolas. Mike Mignola and his daughter Katie did a story that was published in Dark Horse Maverick Happy Endings. And that was kind of a cool, interesting story that explored some kind of difficult themes. So that was kind of a cool one. I like that story. Um, Best single issue was Stuff of Dreams by Kim Deitch. That was actually republished. I think it's 3 volumes as Alias the Cat as a trade paperback, if you ever decide you want to read those. Fables wins for Best Serialized. Daredevil wins for Best Continuing Series. Extraordinary Gentleman, Volume 2 wins for Best Limited. Best New Series is Fable, or Fables. My guy Mike Kunkel continues to dominate with Hero Bear and the Kid for another year, entitled for a younger audience. Mike Mignola's Amazing Screw on Head, which is weird but fantastic. He's the guy who does Hellboy and the like. That continued on and won Best Humor. Best Writer goes to Brian Michael Bendis. Best Writer Artist to Eric Schanauer, who is doing Age of Bronze. Best Penciler or Penciler Inkler Team was Kevin O'Neill for League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Best Painter or Multimedia went to George Pratt for his Wolverine Natsuki book. And Best Colorist was Dave Stewart, who's going to win a lot. Best Letterer, obviously, was Todd Klein, because he's the only one allowed on the ballot. And Best Cover Artist, Adam Hughes, is also going to win a lot of those, because he is pretty fantastic, too.
So we weren't kidding about the fact that Daredevil had a pretty good year. It was such a good year, they got Best Continuing Series this year.
Absolutely. And its writer gets Best Writer. Yeah.
And its writer gets Best Writers. So, yes, next week, we're going to have a lot, going to get to talk a lot about Daredevil and what Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Maleev do with that this year. So,
absolutely.
Did we have any Hall of Fame members this year?
Absolutely, a number of them. We got Jack Davis, who worked with EC and Mad, did a lot of things there. We have Will Elder, who worked with EC and Mad, and also Playboy. We have L. Feldstein, who, surprise of surprises, worked with EC and Mad. Bernard Krigstein, he's our guy from EC, right? He did not work with Mad magazine, but he's the one who did Master Race and had that book written about him that came out this year, the year he died. John Severin from EC and Mad, and also worked with Marvel. His Marie Severin is also in the Hall of Fame. So I believe that's his sister, if I'm not mistaken. So, but the Severins both made it. And then Herge, European artist who did the Tintin books, which not a lot of Americans know about Tintin, but it is huge in Europe. So, interesting note, by the way, in this year of Hall of Famers, we have three of them, Feldstein, Severin, and Elder, who all went to high school together. So when you talk about like the New York connection, it is so strong that literally like the New York magnet school for technical arts or fine arts, which they had at that point, three of the guys who went in the Hall of Fame this year all, I don't know if they graduated together, but they were in school together at the same time at this same high school.
Wow.
Which again, that whole idea of just how important New York is, not only to the settings of comic books, but to the very fabric of the people who make the comic books, you know?
Sure. Yeah. All right. So as we wrap up looking at comics as a whole, Dan, outside of Marvel, what were some of your favorite comics from this year?
So much great stuff. But I really loved the first few arcs of Fables, and I enjoyed Hush a lot. There are a bunch of other things I could go through as well, but I limited myself to two. I couldn't do just one, even though I'm supposed to.
Totally understand. All right. We've gone quite in depth here so far on the year in comics, but now we got to focus in on Marvel and what they were doing in 2002. The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, Dan, there was a lot that happened out talking about comics as a whole, things going on at the box office, obviously the big Spider-Man movie. What was going on at Marvel in 2002? Was this it? Obviously, they're back up to number one again with units and dollars. What was this like? What was the year like for them this year?
No, it was interesting because when I was looking at the year, it was quiet and yet very successful. Like, it appears this is the sort of year where Marvel is just consolidating its gains. They're not doing anything particularly crazy in terms of launching new universes or launching a ton of new characters. They're just building on the new things that they've already started and kind of solidifying them. So we had, Spider-Man bringing a lot of attention to the Marvel brand overall.
Sure.
We've got strong sales. They're back up on top of the industry. So everything's good there. But when we look at it in terms of, what's big and exciting, there's some things, but not as many as you'd think with how good as it looks. So
Sure.
we had 219 total series this year, which is up a little bit. Total new series, we had 167. Ending series, we had 149. So again, this is I think, becoming a metric we can look at to see how they're feeling about the health of things, is
Right.
we're almost 20 more series started than ending, where for most of the last few years or decade, we've been seeing a compacting of those series. Now for the last few years, it's starting to accordion up a little bit. So of those, a lot of them obviously, again, were one shots or were trade paperbacks and that sort of stuff. But there were a number of new books launched as well. As far as events, there really aren't any events for the next few years. They've kind of gotten away from doing the big event type books.
Okay.
But we do have something called Infinity Abyss. So if you remember, like Infinity War and all these other big, sort of like Warlock and Thanos type things, this is another Starlin Infinity storyline. It's I think 5 or 6 issues, and essentially there's clones of Thanos created that go around and cause trouble in various things.
Oh no.
So like these weird genetic reproduction clones that kind of are like some of the other heroes, but they cause trouble. And so this is not one of the classic Infinity storylines. I think it's largely even just been sort of swept under the rug and people ignore it.
Sure.
But technically it's a Jim Starlin Infinity storyline. I don't think it crossed into a lot of things, but it did have a few that it went into. As far as best-selling books, Ultimates #1 was the best-selling book of the year. That was obviously a huge success. Again, this is kind of what they were doing. Ultimate Spider-Man launched the Ultimate line a year or so ago. Now they're expanding that by bringing the Avengers in, renaming them the Ultimates in this universe and changing things. We also have X-Men and Spider-Man books that came out new and did well, that sort of stuff.
Ultimate's book, we read that when we were preparing for the first Avengers film.
Yeah.
That was a really, really big, really interesting book.
And it's interesting because kind of reading up for this, I saw some new documentaries that talked about how they even talk a little bit about the fact that Ultimates itself was made specifically to be a story that would essentially help lead towards the movies. So when you look at the construction of the Ultimates comics, I always thought it was sort of just accidental how cinematic it was and how realistic some of these things were. But this was about the time that Marvel Studios was starting to get formed.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so it looks like Quesada and Gemmis were even sort of saying, we should start finding ways to make our characters a little bit more like what we're going to need for the movies. And so that's what you get with the Ultimates, right? They come in, and Millar is essentially, when he's writing it, is writing it specifically in a way where it's got that sort of reinvention of some of these in a more realistic, could make sense in a live action sort of way.
Right.
Which is probably one of the reasons why we see so much of it adapted out for that. And then, of course, Brian Hitch's art is beautiful for that. And a lot of his designs, like his design for Captain America's uniform, the design even for sort of a lot of the other characters, and the way that he does some of the stitching and some of the uniforms, really just translated almost directly over to the screen. So, yeah, that was a huge book for them.
Right. So let's talk about some of the things that are happening, like in the books or other things that are happening within the Marvel titles this year. So did they try and do anything to capitalize on Spider-Man being all over the place in 2010?
I mean, there were tons of tie-ins. The merchandising and toy tie-ins were astonishing. They were everywhere, right? So they had, all of the fast food stores and everything would have their Happy Meals and their toys and that, and then you had Spider-Man stuff plastered everywhere. But in the comics themselves, they did do a Spider-Man comic adaptation, which is weird because it's a comic book adapting a movie that is adapting the comic stories.
Oh my
there
goodness.
you go. Eating the Ouroboros of the Marvel Universe. But there were a bunch of things that I don't know they were to go on those coattails, but you had Spider-Man Blue by Loeb and Sale. If you remember Daredevil Yellow,
Yes,
same guys who did
that.
Daredevil Yellow, now
Mhm.
doing kind of the same thing, that year one sort of thing with Spider-Man in Spider-Man Blue. We also have Spider-Man and the Black Cat by Kevin Smith. Remember when Kevin Smith wrote Daredevil? Yeah, well, now he's coming back, and it all comes from Daredevil these days. They're all just copying the Daredevil stuff. But yeah, he came back and did a miniseries, Spider-Man and the Black Cat, with Terry and Rachel Dotson. Art's fantastic, interesting, kind of cool story. So I enjoyed that one as well. I thought that it was neat the way at this point Smith was just bopping back in every once in a while. They'd learned to give him miniseries outside of the regular run, so that
Right.
obviously there was not a monthly title hanging in the balance, and that's going to be pretty much the way I think a lot of people handle him from now on. But it's that was fun. We also had a guy named Bruce Jones who started his Hulk run, and this is going to be one of the best runs of Hulk. I'm not a huge Hulk fan, but I enjoyed a lot of these. One of the best runs of Hulk, probably since the mid to early '90s, right? Um, this is another one of those where Hulk's on the run. It feels kind of like, in some ways, the television show. He basically like shaves his head and goes incognito, and he's wandering around, and he's got this sort of secret man in the chair on a phone that is helping him, and that turns out to be his reincarnated ex-wife and the like. So there's all sorts of things going on, but yeah, I enjoyed those. I think that was a big thing because, again, each of these characters, they're trying to get back sort of in their groove to find who they are in the new century. And this is kind of where I think they started figuring out who Hulk was in the new century. Um,
Let's talk about new series this year. What are some of the notable series that weren't like limited, like one shots or short runs? What are some of the bigger new series that ended up going on for a little bit?
Excellent question. There were a few. The longest running book that launched this year was the new Captain America. And this one's interesting because it's the whole idea of what exactly is Captain America in a post 9/11 world. You know, how angry is he? How vengeful is he? What now are the principles he stands on, and how far is he willing to go when America's been attacked? You know, um, this has always been through all of his history. Cap has been kind of this guy who he stands for America, but he also is always questioning America.
Right.
And you know, and so this new one, it's an interesting title. It's by John A. Ryber and art by John Cassidy, fantastic John Cassidy. That's going to last a couple of years. A new Weapon X series, 128 issues. X Static, which is one of the weirder X-Men books you'll ever see. It's by Milligan and Allred. Allred is the guy who does like very almost cartoony sort of Steve Ditko on hallucinogen type drugs kind of art. And it's fantastic, but these are very interesting stories. I like the ecstatic stuff. It came out of X-Force, but then it's its own thing as well. New Captain Marvel launched, went 25 issues. Agent X and Soldier X went 12 and 15 issues. We had X-Men Evolution for 9 issues. And that really is about it as far as things that are going to actually make it. So not a lot of new stuff.
And then the Ultimates line that you had mentioned earlier.
Well, the Ultimates is not ongoing. It was a 13 issue limited series.
Okay,
13 or
so
12. I think it's 13.
Okay.
Oh, I had that in the wrong place, didn't I? Yes. Ultimates is a limited series. Sorry about that. But yeah, it will spawn out to other Ultimates. There'll be Ultimates 2, and God help us, Ultimates 3, which is, I believe that's the one that's one of the worst of all the comic series in the early 2000s. So we'll get to that eventually, and I'll have opinions. But
Right.
um, but in any case, yeah.
Wait, all right, then let's move into notable limited series then. What were some of the ones that had a very short run but were probably memorable or definitely would be something that we should consider seeking out?
And these by limited series, again, just to remind folks, that means they were intentionally not going to go longer than a certain level. Like Ultimates was 12 issues or whatever, because that's how many issues it was planned for, and then it's done. There were some, like, the Marvel Knights line went 6 issues and died out in 2002, not because it was intended to be 6 issues, but because nobody bought it, which is different. That's not a
Right.
limited series. That's just a series that got canceled, right?
Yes.
So, but so Ultimates, Spider-Man Blue, Spider-Man Black Cat, Infinite Abyss, all those were limited. We had Moment of Silence, which was another 9/11 tribute. It was an interesting one. It had like 4 different series, like an anthology book that followed different regular people who were affected by 9/11. You know, firefighters who drove from the Midwest to go to New York to help with cleanup, and people who made sacrifices on the day trying to help with various things and stuff like that. There's no superheroes in it. The superheroes in this book are the regular people who just kind of did what they could, right? So that was a good one. It sold really well as well. There was a new Howard the Duck that was actually written by Steve Gerber. I didn't really enjoy this one, and I normally love Steve Gerber's Howard the Duck, but this was weird. Like, I mean, that goes without saying. It's Steve Gerber, Howard the Duck, but yeah. So that came out this year. Paradise X, which is another one of those Earth X titles. There was a new Tiger miniseries. I always enjoy the Tiger miniseries. As were Daredevil folks, there was a new Elektra miniseries called Elektra, Glimpse, and Echo. It was written and painted by a guy named Scott Morse. So completely painted art, as you might expect. It has ninjas and the like, right? And it's a pretty traditional sort of Elektra storyline, but it does look really good. The art actually is the best way to describe it for people who are reading comics now is it's got a Peach Momoko kind of feel to it, kind of a painted and pastel-y sort of very fluid kind of art style. So if you like that kind of thing, it'd be worth checking it out. And then just as a note, because we are seeing Tokyo Pop do its thing and everything, Marvel did debut a number of Mangaverse titles, limited series, testing the water for Marvel manga, just to see how that would work.
Sure. So what is the year look like as far as new characters? I'm kind of thinking.
Did you look at this list? Did you look at this list?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, it seems like there's enough here that there should be something. But looking at these names, this is not a who's who list this year.
Well, I mean, and if you count the ultimate versions of all of the heroes, which I don't, like Ultimate Thor debuted this year, right?
Right.
Guess what? He's just Thor with a different backstory. So, but as far as actual new characters, most of them came about from just a few books. So the X books mostly, we had Moonbeam or Dead Girl. We had Outlaw, also her name is Inez Temple. Phantom X came out in New X-Men. Venus de Milo in Ecstatics. Nicholas Gleason, who's Wolf Cub in Chamber. Kevin Casper Cole in Black Panther. And he's going to become the White Tiger. And then Dust, Soraya Kadir in New X-Men as well. You've probably never heard of any of these people.
The only one I know actually is Dust, and that was because I started playing another mobile game called Marvel Contest of Champions. Okay. And they had it's basically like Street Fighter but with Marvel characters. And one of the first characters I got in Marvel Contest of Champions was Dust. And I'm like, I have no idea who this is.
I'm fascinated by that. Interesting. There you go. So by default, because you have found him in a Marvel mobile game in 2024, I declared Dust the most interesting of the characters that came out. Some of these others have continued to be around as well, but nonetheless, it was not a year of you know new Wolverine or something like this.
Oh,
So
definitely not. So let's move on and let's talk about things that came to an end this year. Ongoing series that reached their end this year. Was there any big titles to speak of?
yeah, but it's interesting because most of them, like X Force, is the longest running one that ended. It started in '91, ended with issue 130, but then Ecstatic comes out and essentially is just a continuation of it. Cable
State,
goes 108 issues and ends, but then we have a new Cable series that came out this year. Deadpool ends with issue 70, and that actually, we don't get a new Deadpool series this year, so that one actually does end. Captain America ends with 50, and we get a new Captain America title that's going to start up.
right.
Captain Marvel ends with 35 issues, and we get a new Captain Marvel title. Ultimate Marvel Team Up ends, which is an ultimate book. That actually, even though it was an ongoing series, it doesn't surprise me much that that one ended up ending a little early. It was almost like it felt like it was a limited series, even though it wasn't. And then we lost Defenders at 12 issues, was the next longest running book that ended that year. So those were the 7 books that had gone a year or more that ended.
Not exactly. Like, I mean, obviously X Force and Cable and Deadpool and even Captain America going 50 issues. Those are some pretty big titles, but they all ended up, short of Deadpool, all getting something started up relatively quickly. So it's almost
That
like they
really,
didn't go anywhere.
I would entirely agree that when you just reboot them like that, it doesn't even really count as a cancellation. So the only ones people really lost access to this year would have been Deadpool and then the Ultimate Marvel Team Up and Defenders. All the other ones were still somewhere or another around. So, and again, the Captain Marvel in 2002, we're still not to the Carol Danvers Captain Marvel. We're still in the sort of Son of Captain Marvel era of Captain
Sure.
Marvel.
All right, let's move on and let's talk about the bullpen this year. So editor in chief is still Joe Quesada.
Yep.
What are we having as far as number of people with a credit in a Marvel title this year? How many people did you have that?
Yep. I've changed the total staff number to unique credits because I think that's a better indication of what I'm actually tracking. So I had
Yeah.
462 unique credits in Marvel books this year. Of those, 113 of them were new staff. So we had 350 or so people who had already worked for the company and about 115 new come in this year.
You have a note of a passing this year who's big for Marvel.
Yeah, we talked a little bit previously about it, but John Buscema actually died in 2002, and he was just a huge part of Marvel history. Buscema was one of those guys who came in the early part of the 60s, and he worked on Avengers. He worked on a lot of the other books. Eventually
Worked on
took
Daredevil.
over, worked on Daredevil. Eventually took over Conan and became sort of the artist for Conan. But really, in a lot of ways, when Stan Lee decided to do the book How to Draw Marvel Comics or How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way or whatever, John Buscema is the guy he brought in to draw that, right? And so it gives you some idea of how Lee felt about him, right?
Sure.
So Buscema had a classic, very fluid, very strong style. He did action incredibly well. He did just almost everybody had this energy about them, even when they were standing still. And so I think he was somebody who's sometimes underrated, but he's absolutely a foundational member of the Marvel bullpen. And so that is a big loss. So
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when we were talking about volume 1 of Daredevil. I don't know that we gave John Buscema enough credit, but he definitely did a very good job in the books that he was a part of in
Yeah.
the Daredevil run in volume 1.
Yeah. I will note he is better at smashing stuff action than like looping through the sky action, right?
Okay.
He was never a Spider-Man artist necessarily. He was going to be, more of a Thor and Conan kind of guy. So,
Gotcha.
you know,
All right, let's talk about the rookie of the year for 2002. Looks like you've got some pretty interesting names on the list, some people that had some pretty strong credits as far as consideration,
yep.
and then we've got a pretty recognizable name for the winner. So let's talk about who was in consideration for the rookie of the year this year.
So I think Corey Petit almost has to be noted just because he blows everybody else on my list away as far as lettering or as far as total credits. He's got over
Right.
3,000 lettering credits for Marvel, which is a substantial body of work, right? That's a pretty good career. Lee Lowridge, over 300 coloring credits as well. So also somebody who's done a lot of stuff for Marvel over the years. Both of those folks, solid work. Petit, actually, a lot of it, I love his colors. So he would be a very good choice if we didn't have somebody else that was also a really fantastic creator. Other people that could be in consideration, Gail Simone did her first work for Marvel this year. Interesting thing with her is she has been DC exclusive for so much of her career. So she really, even though she's a fantastic writer, one of my favorite writers, in fact, her work on like Birds of Prey, I absolutely adore. But she hasn't done that much stuff for Marvel. She started out on Deadpool here in the early 2000s. She did a Domino series sometime in the 2020s. Occasionally, she's come in and written some stuff for Marvel. But her actual body of work is relatively small considering how big a name she is in the industry, at least with Marvel. Now with DC, her list of credits is
huge credit.
Is a mile long, but so she's just had one company she works with pretty much all the time. We also have Scotty Young, who I know him best for all of his variant covers. If you ever see what look like, I think they're called chibi sort of variant covers for things.
Yep.
Scotty Young is the guy who's doing those almost all the time. And some of them can be very valuable. A lot of people really like them. They're highly collectible. So he has kind of done a lot of those. He also has done interior work as well. And in fact, he won an Eisner for Marvel for the wonderful Wizard of Oz books that he did in I think sometime here in the late 2000s. So,
I recognize Scotty Young. He's got there is a large number of Marvel Snap variants.
I would bet there would be.
Scotty Young, chibi baby looking big head
Yep.
Versions of the characters. And I also have actually a couple variant covers. Moon Knight had one of the series had a Scotty Young variant cover that I ended up getting when I was at the comic book store as well. All of these are really great options, but we've got a pretty big name in the winner's circle for Rookie of the Year this year.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this one. Jason Aaron did his first writing for Marvel this year, and you probably already know this, but Jason Aaron has written some pretty cool comic books. So he's done Ghost Rider, he's done Thor, he's done Wolverine, Avengers, Punisher. Among the things that he's most known for, the War of the Realms crossover, the original Sin series, and of course those Thor books where he co-created Gore the God Butcher and essentially made Jane Foster into the Mighty Thor. Which, if any of that sounds familiar from going to the movies sometime in the last few years, he was almost exclusively the architect of the stories that they based the Thor Love and Thunder movie off of, for better or for worse. So I'm I'm increasingly not worried about what people care and just going to admit I like Thor, Love and Thunder, by the way. So take that, all of you.
Yes.
Even if I'm
Yes.
not supposed to.
I remember reading some of the Jason Aaron Thor books, and we talked about it. Thor is kind of like Superman insofar as he is really not that interesting a character. And so, like, because he's so powerful, what can you actually do to make a worthy adversary for them, right?
Mhm.
And Jason Aaron did some, like, I have not read all of Jason Aaron's Thor, but the books that Jason Aaron has written them Thor that I have read have been amazing and completely changed my mind as to how good a Thor story I thought a Thor story could be.
And he's written a lot of Thor. He's written a lot of comics for Marvel just in general. But they are well worth tracking down and enjoying if you haven't read them yet. He's also been blessed, we have to admit, with some pretty fantastic artists. I mean, Russell Dauterman has been on a lot of this stuff and is just astonishing talent. So that is one of the things you get by working with Marvel, though, is access to some pretty amazing artists.
Sure.
If you're a good writer, you can take advantage of that. So, but it's I'm pretty happy with him as our Rookie of the Year because I think he is someone who truly has sort of bent the needle in terms of making important, useful, and entertaining changes to the Marvel universe that have sort of impacted the storylines and the company going forward.
Yes, no, I think that is a fantastic choice. Congratulations to Jason Aaron on your 2002 Rookie of the Year. Dan, we're running really long, but real quick, tell us your favorite Marvel comics for 2002.
I'm also supposed to have one here, and I can't do that either. I loved Daredevil, I loved Ultimates, and I loved the Black Cat stories by our man Smith. They were all fantastic. It was, as we go through this, what I'm really remembering now is how lucky I was that this was the time, just finished up getting married, settling down a little bit and the like. And this is the time of comics when I really started heading to the store every week again, was probably in the early 2000s. And this is the stuff that I was picking up. And it was an amazing time to be reading comic books. These were really good.
And if you want to know about the Daredevil run, we're going to be talking about that in great detail next week. And there is a lot of really fun stuff to talk about, including our spotlight, which is going to be, I think, a pretty pivotal point going forward in the series. So yeah, there is. This I can see why this year Brian Michael Bendis got Best Writer and Daredevil got Best Continuing Series this year.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, with that, let's wrap it up for this week. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you share the show via social media or leave us a review. That'll help other new listeners find the show that much easier. Now, whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts on this week's show. Maybe you read some of those great comics that Dan couldn't pick just one of, and you want to tell us your thoughts on them. You can send us those via email. The address is comments@comicsovertime.com, or you can reach out to us via social media. Dan, we're shutting down the X social media account, and we are going to go moving exclusively to Blue Sky going forward. Apologies if you're not on that platform, but would recommend it because there is a number of really great creators that have migrated from the social media previously known as Twitter over to Blue Sky, and seems to be a little bit less toxicity on the platform as a whole.
The lack of an algorithm and some of the other things makes it a lot easier to actually find what you want. So There also are a number of what are called starter packs to find comics creators, podcast creators, comics fans. So it's a really easy platform to sort of get built back up to having kind of a bit of a group on. And I have found that I've had better and more interactions on Blue Sky over the last 6 months to a year than I'd had probably in the last couple of years over on Twitter, because it had just sort of been dying on the vine anyway. So I think that I'm pretty happy with the idea that we're heading there.
So yeah, we had talked about this. We're going to pull the plug kind of going around now going forward. So you're going to probably stop seeing updates on Twitter very shortly. And we're going to be just on Blue Sky. We are at Comics Over Time on Blue Sky. We welcome you to come on over, join us there, find a lot of those great creators that have already migrated over there as well, and definitely reach out, interact with us. We'd love to hear from you, and yeah, that is
Absolutely.
just thought I would mention that as we're wrapping up the show this week. And we've got Daredevil to talk about next week. This is going to be great.
Happy to see you are also excited about these, because I am as well. Great stuff. Looking forward to talking about it with folks.
Until next week, take care, everybody.
See you later.